I'm Jeff Hutton. This is On the Level. More than 100 million voters head to the polls at regional elections on December 9th. It's no means the biggest round of voting Indonesia will see. In fact, turnout might be a little lackluster, and we'll hear about that later. But the contest will be colorful. It will pit reformists against establishment candidates, feature dynastic scions, and at least one grudge match. Back in 2018, Munafri Arifudin, nephew of the former president, Joseph Kalla, lost his mayoral race in Makassar to a blank box. The episode is now a bit of election lore. Arifudin successfully petitioned the Supreme Court to disqualify his opponent, the incumbent Danny Pomanto. But voters had the last say. In instances where candidates are running unopposed, voters here have the right to check an empty box on the ballot, signifying they don't support the candidate. In Makassar in 2018, 53% said tidak mau. In the background of all this is a return to Indonesia from self-imposed exile of the hardline cleric Rizieq Shihab. He's the founder of the Islamic Defenders Front, or the FPI. And worryingly, also, there is a sudden acceleration of COVID-19 cases. Kevin O'Rourke is the author of the intelligence briefing Reformasi Weekly. He's a regular on the pod, and with so much happening, I thought we'd better have him back for a longish chat. Fun fact, after publishing 700 or so of his newsletters over the past 15 years, he might just hold the English language record on words written about Indonesia by one man. Okay, maybe not a fact, but a reasonable working hypothesis. We begin our conversation with an update on COVID-19. Friends, Kevin O'Rourke. Kevin O'Rourke, great to have you back on the pod.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
The dust has settled there in Maine. The results have finally been accepted. How does it feel now that going into Thanksgiving? You have a lot to be thankful for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a nerve-wracking time in the U.S. and the public health crisis is probably going to get worse in the month of December until a vaccine finally undergoes distribution. But at least politically, the Trump era is finally ending now.
Well, from health crisis there to health crisis in Indonesia, COVID, always in the background, returning to the fore, active cases on the rise, the fastest rate since September, right? The week-on-week rise is something like 28 or 30%. You said in your last missive. What's driving that increase, and how significant is it?
Well, there seems to be a correlation with the testing. So when the testing levels expand, then the cases expand naturally. And unfortunately, there's been an inability to bring about a steady, sustained increase in molecular testing for various reasons, one of which I think people are reluctant to undergo swab tests. They don't see much advantage or benefit. And on the other hand, they see downsides in terms of having to undergo isolation and social stigma. And therefore, authorities are having a hard time getting people to take part in testing operations, even though there are statutes requiring people to undergo testing when necessary. So as a result, the positivity rate still remains too high. It's at 16% as of 23 November nationwide. And that's a level that's too high to really have full confidence that the official data on the epidemic is really capturing the extent of the disease. So there's been an increase since there was a long vacation at the end of October. And that reversed a sort of a slowdown, especially in active cases that had been taking place during mid-October. Nevertheless, the increase that's underway right now was accelerating during the second week of November, and in the third week of November, pace has slowed down slightly in terms of growth of active cases nationwide. That stands at 5% week on week now, 23 November. Relative to a lot of other countries, of course, Indonesia's pandemic is minor compared to the U.S., especially. The deaths that Indonesia has incurred over 8 months is equivalent to about 2 weeks in the U.S.
I just want to stop you there. That is just astounding for me. And I think it would be surprising to most of the listeners. You would think that a country like Indonesia that has very limited healthcare services and trained professionals, and ones that can administer the swab test, they're in short supply, those nurses and doctors that in ICU units. It's astounding that deaths from COVID here are a fraction of the amount in a rich country like the United States. Well, why is it that Indonesia seems to be avoiding the worst of it? I think we've talked about this before, but it's been a few months. Have you seen any narratives play out that that could give a bit of concrete reason for this?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of other countries, especially the developed ones and also ones like India, have very extensive testing. So therefore, they're capturing more accurately what's happening. But even after accounting for that, even if you take Indonesia's total deaths to date, which are 16,000, and you double that or triple that, it's still,
well, 36,
10, 15% of,
right.
yeah, the U.S. deaths are going towards 300,000 now.
Right.
And then the countries are relatively the same size. That's why the U.S. is a convenient comparison. So the age profile of the Indonesian population is important. It's a far younger population than the U.S. and also generally healthier. It doesn't have the obesity that's so commonplace in the U.S., at least. And it's a rural country, and there's a lot more that happens outdoors in Indonesia. So those are probably all factors, but it's a mystery. I mean, there's a lot of things that are still mysterious about the pandemic.
Do you think there'll be another shutdown of Jakarta? It's the rise is actually in Jakarta, isn't it?
Yeah, that last week Jakarta was the biggest contributor, but Central Java had some real momentum happening also. This week it seems as if maybe cases in Jakarta are now starting to slow down again, and actually that's just basically on the 2 days of data, really. They peaked on 21 November, and there's been lower cases in the 2 following days. That may not mean much, but yeah, they're growing weekly just 24% in Jakarta as of 23 November. So that is pushing it. Yeah, if that rate sustains, then I think the governor will want to reinstore those transitional or the limited social restrictions that were used with quite some effect in late September and early October.
Yeah, when he hits those breaks, the numbers of active cases really come plummeting down, don't they? It's surprisingly effective.
That has happened twice. There's been a strong correlation between the restrictions in place and the case momentum decelerating because of, I think, gatherings in restaurants and places of worship, things like that.
Now, vaccine, very much in the news in the US and in Europe, with fantastic news from Pfizer and Moderna. Indonesia is getting vaccines from China. What's the latest on that? How soon can we expect a rollout?
Well, what's interesting is that no one knows, apparently including the president, because his messages have changed a couple times, and then most recently they've been conspicuously fuzzy. So he's waiting to see, I think, as is everyone else, in terms of the latest available data that comes forth from the Chinese manufacturers and also the pipeline of supply from the production facilities. The really positive thing, though, well, it's 2 things. One is that the president, Joko Widodo, has emphasized twice now over the past 2 weeks that safety really matters first and foremost. And that allays some concern that the government's initial plan to apply vaccines was too ambitious or robust, and it could have potentially put several million people at risk if there had been something faulty in the vaccine that had been undetected because it was put to use too soon. So that's good. Basically, he's pledged to wait until 2 things happen. The WHO approves a product, and the Indonesian Food and Drug Oversight Agency, BPOM, also approves it. What's unclear is whether that approval is what he's waiting for the mass application for the whole population, or will that also apply to frontline workers who are quite numerous in Indonesia. They're talking about 9 million healthcare workers, security personnel, civil servants, and teachers all getting priority to receive a vaccine under emergency use authorization. So it's unclear what the exact timing and phasing of all that is. But the other bit of good news, though, is that the Coronavac vaccine, sorry, it's not Sinopharm, but
Sinovac, right?
Sinovac. Is looking good. The company released its results from the phase 1 and 2 trials conducted earlier this year, and they were quite positive.
But those are quite limited. Can you tell us a little bit about the vaccines themselves? How do they differ from the Pfizer and Moderna ones?
So there's different technology. This is the Chinese vaccines from Sinovac and Sinopharm are using conventional delivery mechanisms, unlike Moderna and Pfizer, which are using new or untested mechanism of messenger RNA. So they each have their strengths and weaknesses. In both cases, the initial testing has shown the effectiveness is quite high. Of course, the Sinovac product is only based on phase 1-2 trials involving 700 people. So there's still a phase 3 taking place in 3 locations, one of which is West Java with 1,600 participants, and those results should be known in January. But so far, there's no adverse reactions reported yet. But basically, the Sinovac and Sinopharm products use an attenuated coronavirus grafted from a primate. So that's sort of the main way that vaccines have worked in past decades. Whereas the messenger RNA instructs the cells of the host, the recipient, to produce a part of the coronavirus, the spike protein, which is only part of it, so it's not dangerous, but it teaches the body to recognize that. So it's easier to produce, I think, easier to administer. However, the product needs to be kept in very cold storage, and that cold storage would be problematic for Indonesia. So these Chinese products, will be better because they can be kept at refrigerator temperatures.
Well, I was wondering about that. Just how appropriate would the Chinese products be for a country like Indonesia that's so vast and with scarce infrastructure and frankly quite hot? It's just a better product, isn't it, for a country like this one?
Well, if somebody could invent a freeze-dried vaccine, like the freeze-dried ice cream that astronauts eat in space, that would be good, because then you can distribute that all over the archipelago, no problem. Because the Chinese vaccines are better because they only need refrigerated temperatures, but even refrigerators are hard to find in a lot of places in Indonesia. So the cold chain logistics, even at refrigerator temperatures, is poor in Indonesia. So it shows that it's possible to vaccinate half the population quite feasibly, the half living in the cities and towns. The cold chain reaches there. But to get into the rural communities is going to be a real logistics headache. So,
well, not only to get into the rural communities, but to get those people to come back twice, or to come back a second time. Like, so you can get them to line up once, but getting them to come back in 3 weeks, that's going to take some doing and a bit of explaining, on top of the fact that there is a slice of the population that isn't so sure about they want any vaccine at all. There's a bit of an anti-vaxxer movement. There's a lot of on the ground obstacles that need to be overcome.
That's right. Yeah, I envisage the government eventually needing to use an element of mild coercion to really push the vaccine out. They'll never cover 100%, of course. But of course, you don't need to have 100%. No one knows what the percentage is really necessary to bring about immunity in the population. The guess is 70% roughly. But even that is going to be a long, arduous process, though, for sure.
What's the receptivity to vaccines in general? And this one, have you seen any data suggesting that what percent of the population will refuse?
Right. Yeah, there have been some opinion polls done by telephone, hand phones, and they indicate about 50 to 60% of respondents would be willing to take a vaccine. But those were done in July when there was, I think, very poor understanding of what a vaccine would be and what it means and what the risks are and so on. So that number should go up.
What would it do for Indonesia's standing in the region and its ability for its people to travel and to conduct business and to win investment and to interact with the global economy if it has trouble rolling out a vaccine for the coronavirus, if it is sort of bogged down? Do you foresee any sort of blowback economically or diplomatically?
Well, sure, yeah. Economically, tourism is crucial for Bali in particular, and in fact, there may be a case to be made for prioritizing that particular island for vaccination in order to create a bubble of tourism between Bali and a few other contributors. But more generally, Indonesia has an opportunity to emerge out of the crisis a little bit better off than certain other competitor countries, simply because the damage from the pandemic has not been as severe in Indonesia as it has in some other countries. So any missteps in the vaccination process would squander that.
One of the accelerants of the spread of the coronavirus is our friend Rizieq Shihab. He's back, and he's holding rallies that are doubling almost as super spreader events, although I don't know if you would agree. Could we start maybe with a little bit of background about what you call it HRS now? Habib Rizieq Shihab, the founder of the FPE, the Islamic Defenders Front. And he's proving to be a thorn once again in the side of Joko Widodo. A potted history of the cleric, if you please.
Yeah, sure. He is from a kind of rough neighborhood in central Jakarta called Petamburan. It's part of Tanah Abang, which is a merchant district and a hub for thugs and gangs that perpetrate racketeering because there are so many street level shopkeepers in the area. He himself is from a ethnic Arab Indonesian family, thus his last name is a Arabic one, Shihab. But he's taken on an honorific title of Habib, and that's one thing that's received some scrutiny recently, because typically that's something you attain through some real credentials in terms of scholastics, which he actually does not have. He simply started adopting use of that word in 1998, so therefore he's known as Habib Rizieq Shihab. When in 1998 he founded an Islamic flavored gang of street thugs known as the Islamic Defenders Front, FPI, and then this became famous right around that time in the immediate post-Suharto years for sometimes assisting police and authorities in intimidating student protesters, especially in 1999, but more generally doing their own operations to punish minorities and to also be vigilantes, closing bars and entertainment venues during religious periods. Shakedowns practically is what they really were. And they perpetrated a lot of violence and created a lot of harm and caused casualties during these years. And it went on right through the Yudhoyono era. But then Rizieq, his profile changed in 2016 when Islamic organizations banded together against the reformist Jakarta governor at the time, Ahok, and that movement elevated him. Then police started various cases against him, and that prompted him to go into self-imposed exile for 3.5 years, and now he's returned, and his stature has changed definitely over the years. So it's important to not look at him as a street thug, actually, even though it's tempting to do so.
Someone that's going around smashing up shops and bars during Ramadan comes from those sort of hard scrabble beginnings. How does someone like that in an Indonesian context gain such a following? What do people see in him? What does he deliver to his followers that they can't get from others?
Right. Well, I would categorize him among the ranks of leaders around the world that have been emerging over the past decade, Trump, one of which, and other ultra-nationalist leaders. It's important not to draw too many comparisons between Rizieq and Trump, but there are some commonalities there. One of the obvious differences, of course, is that Rizieq is propounding avowedly Islamist ideology, but they're both very much against the state and the system and the establishment. In fact, Rizieq is denouncing Widodo as an illegal president. And so that, I think, is one of the pillars of his appeal, is the fact that he gives voice to a disgruntled segment of society which is fed up with the status quo and the establishment. And Rizieq is also simply very mesmerizing in terms of his oratory, and very persuasive and very appealing for people who are willing to pursue blind faith, really. And yeah.
Is there an anti-corruption element to his appeal? Like in other countries, these firebrands, they gain a following because they're after corrupt elites. Is that what he's doing too? Is that part of the rhetoric?
Well, he's sanctimonious, and he's campaigning against sin, and it's a very broad brush for him. So it would involve corruption, yes, but it's actually not the most important component. He's a purveyor of hate, sectarianism. So targets are minorities, and over the years these have included Christian groups, also Shia Muslims, whom these hardliners do not regard as Muslims. Shia are extremely tiny in Indonesia, but there are nonetheless a few tiny neighborhoods to target, and the Ahmadiyya sect in particular. And now Rizieq is targeting China and Chinese nationals and Chinese investment.
You mentioned China there. Is he picking up on Chinese mistreatment of Muslim Uyghurs?
No, I don't think so. Maybe. I haven't noticed that.
I don't get that.
Ironically. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
what?
Well, the factual research does not play a part in much of it. There's a lot of fanciful elements to begin with, so they don't really need truth. They have plenty of ammunition to use.
They're not sitting around the table with the whiteboard and just sort of sketching up a message calendar, right? They're just playing the hits from 1965 onward, right?
Yeah, well, they're not worried about being called out on their references and their sourcing. So,
I guess what I'm trying to drive at is, how much of a threat is he to democratic reforms and the religious secularism that Indonesia has managed to more or less protect?
It's pretty serious, actually, because it's a threat not just to Widodo or a select portion of parliament, but it's a threat to the democratic system as a whole. He is advocating caliphate and the imposition of an Islamic state. And he also may have the potential, remains to be seen, to unify very disparate, diverse parts of Indonesian Islam. Like everything in Indonesia, Islam is complicated and diverse. And typically until now, different types of Islamic organizations in Indonesia have regarded each other as the foremost foes or rivals. There's been a lack of unity, even though Muslims account for 86% of the national population. And part of that disunity has been the lack of a single individual who can emerge above the organizational differences to unify disparate parts. Now, that's one thing to watch right now. And what's a little bit disconcerting is that spokespersons from diverse different Islamic groups are withholding criticism of Rizieq uniformly right now. And if they cede a leadership role to him, then that would really be problematic, I think, for the authorities.
He was in exile because of a sexting scandal he was sending or trafficking in nude photographs with a woman who was not his wife. The sending of images, the trafficking of them in Indonesia is illegal, and someone who is potentially conducting an affair would be deemed as hypocritical. So he was on the lam. He was in Saudi Arabia for 3.5 years, and that is presumably against the law to evade arrest. How is it that he's come back, and what has happened with those charges?
Right. Yeah, his return was a surprise. He had threatened to return and then didn't do it. And then he threatened again to return and didn't do it. And that happened again and again and again. And then the sixth time he did it. So it was quite out of the blue.
6 times charm, right?
Yeah, exactly. The charges, I think that pertains to political will, but technically my understanding is that police are saying that they lack testimony from whoever originally uploaded the hacked text messages to the internet, and without that person's testimony, then they have no case against him. That may be, that may or may not be legally correct on their part, but that's their excuse anyway.
Does that hold water for you, or does it sound like the police are going soft?
Yeah, it's. I think there is a reluctance to go through with prosecuting him, actually, because there may be a fear that putting him in jail will actually make him bigger, turn him into a martyr. That's the problem with a figure like this, is that when his main message is that the authorities are unfairly or unjustly punishing clerics, when he faces accountability for treasonous remarks, then he claims that he's being punished because he's a cleric, and it reinforces his narrative.
Proving it right.
So, as the authorities push harder, it potentially makes him stronger and bigger. So there's a need to debunk his message, and that's where the position of other Islamic authorities or leaders matters.
Is this guy a presidential candidate?
Well, I mean, he's anti-system, so it would be ironic for him to take part in a system that he denounces. So, yeah, he would have to make a tactical decision to use the system for his own ends. That would be interesting. And it looks like right now, instead, what he would like to do is use Anies Baswedan as his proxy.
And Anies Baswedan would not mind being used like this?
Well, he was in 2018 when, 2017, sorry, when he won the Jakarta governor's election with the support of all the Islamic organizations, including FPI.
Publicly declaring support for a caliphate is a big no-no in Indonesia. It goes against all notions of Pancasila and the unitary state. Why hasn't he been silenced or put in jail or somehow sidelined by the government? Because what he's doing is a really big no-no.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of tricky aspects is that Rizieq's rhetoric is actually not wild. He's not a loose cannon by any means. He sounds extremely animated and energetic, of course, but the actual text of what he says is very carefully worded and is very precise in order to tread a very narrow line and sort of walk a tightrope there and avoid going just a little bit too far. But he is always pushing the envelope. So at some stage, I mean, there may be grounds for arresting him on treason. Part of the problem, too, is that the FBI has this unsavory relationship extending back 20 years with the police. The WikiLeaks U.S. State Department cables in 2011 included an excerpt stating that FBI was used by the police for racketeering arrangements, basically. They were a useful ally for the police in conducting quasi-illicit or illicit activities. And therefore, legally pursuing Rizieq risks exposing the police generals that had been part of that. So therefore, Rizieq has enjoyed a degree of impunity. Now, that may be fading now with some turnover of personnel in police and with the increased profile that Rizieq is taking on. But nonetheless, that's sort of a wrinkle that is protecting him. But ultimately, the question of what can the state do, jail him, bankrupt him, ban the organization, exile him, Right now, the military is tearing down banners. So in Jakarta, soldiers from the Jakarta garrison have taken down 900 posters and banners that FPI had erected across the city. So that's been an effective response measure. But some measures are less effective. The TNI, the military chief, had a show of force, in a press conference, and that may have backfired.
The show of force may have backfired.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that was 2 weeks ago. The military chief Hadi Chayanto appeared with 5 commanders of combat units in a really quite striking, unusual press conference. We're wearing combat fatigues and berets, and he made a stern message warning anybody who risks jeopardizing the state. And that actually, I think, just elevated Rizieq's profile and conferred even more importance on him. So that type of approach is probably not sufficiently tactful, I think.
Moving on to regional elections, they are still well and truly on, aren't they, for December? There was some talk of delaying them because of COVID.
No, that's right. Yeah, they are taking place. Of course, there's a lot of risks. They threaten to be a super spreader event in the approximately half of the districts nationwide that are holding voting. And there's also a risk that voter turnout is going to be even lower than it usually is in these types of races, maybe down in the 40 or even 30% level of turnout, which would be very weak.
That's very surprising for Indonesia. They usually tend to be quite high, the turnout.
They tend to be quite high in national elections, especially for president, but the regional head elections can vary a lot. If then there's an exciting, promising, bona fide candidate, then participation can be quite high. But when there's nobody good running, then the participation can be 50%.
So what does it say about the caliber of the candidates? Are there any Jokowis out there?
Right. Well, yeah, I think there are some interesting ones to watch, yes. These races are important for 3 reasons. One is the religious spectrum. Some races sometimes provide voters with a stark choice between a religiously motivated candidate and one who's pluralist, and the election can be a way to take the temperature of that particular electorate. Another is the reform spectrum, where you have candidates who are establishment-oriented and ones who are reformers, care about constituents and public service. And then a third reason is just that the regular conducting of these elections is a mechanism that can convey talented figures up from the grassroots eventually into national politics, as happened, as you mentioned, with Jokowi. So it's important that the elections themselves just occur and go well and recruit decent candidates. The chief weakness is that all 9 major parties, are really patronage-oriented organizations that care little about reform or even democratization. So it's relatively rare that any of these parties will nominate somebody genuinely exciting. And also there's very high entry barriers, so that typically it requires an alliance of parties to get nominated. But nonetheless, once in a while it does happen. So there's a race in Surabaya. So that's at the district level, below the provincial level. It's for mayor. And the outgoing mayor is legendarily popular and successful, Tri Yuris Maharini. So her protege, Eri Cahyadi, is on the ballot, backed by one party, PDIP, the biggest one in the city. And 8 other parties have rallied around a retired police general, Mokhtar Arifin, and he appears to have quite a lot of money at his disposal and no real track record for credible reform. So that's really kind of a stark choice there for voters, and it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out.
A bit of a David and Goliath contest there?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, that's right, because this guy, Eri Cahyadi, he's a career civil servant. He's quite young. He had done a lot within the municipal administration, but was not really all that well known. And really his only claim to fame is that he's the hand-picked person endorsed by this immensely popular outgoing mayor. whereas the other guy has money, has all the parties. He's a police general. He's Mr. Establishment. So it's a stark contrast. And there's other ones like that in South Kalimantan, maybe also Makassar. And then on the religious spectrum, the governor's race in West Sumatra is an interesting one because there's a moderate candidate who seems to be polling well above much more Islamic-oriented candidate who has been the mayor of Padang.
The regional elections have acted as sort of a forward indicator, or maybe some sort of barometer of the country's appetite for reform, for change. And, 6 years of Joko Widodo, what kind of conclusions can we draw from the narratives of the races, the caliber of the candidates themselves, the preponderance of dynasty candidates, the sons and daughters of office holders, of past office holders? It feels a little bit depressing and calcified to me that the fever of 2012 and 2014 has faded.
Right. Well, no, you're too dour, Jeff. It's not so bad.
No? It's not too, well, I mean, Jokowi's son is running for mayor solo, Gibran. I mean,
the glass is always half empty with you.
no.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
Yeah,
prove me wrong.
Put it this way. Yeah, the way I look at it is that the rules are really lousy. Yeah, the entry barriers for participation. You need 20% of seats in the regional assembly in your nominating alliance, and that really confers huge discretion on party leaderships to determine who's going to run. And for parties, this is a huge money-making opportunity because they can sell their nominations to the highest bidder. And so the vast majority of candidates in these races are truly lousy. And yet, despite that, it's evident that voters will produce reform-minded winners almost whenever possible. So it's tantalizing because if the rules were better, then you could really see a dramatic transformation of politics nationwide. But as it is, it's happening at a very incremental pace. But right now there are credible, competent, respectable governors for the country's 3 or maybe even 4 largest provinces, if you want to include Anies Baswedan in Jakarta, Ridwan Kamil in West Java, Ganjar Pranowo in Central Java, Kofifa Indar Parawansa in East Java. And then there's the province of South Sulawesi, which I think is number 7. And there, that may be the best governor of all, Nuruddin Abdullah. So these figures have emerged despite these rules and despite the incrementalism of parties. And that still is taking place. It's happening. So Ridwan Kamil won his election in 2018. And also that year, there was the victory of the empty box in Makassar.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Yeah. So there was a good incumbent named Danny Pomanto who had delivered quite a lot as mayor of the biggest city in South Sulawesi. And he was running against the nephew of Vice President Yusuf Kala, the vice president at the time. His name was Arifudin. And Arifudin used every legal loophole at his disposal to eventually, through the Supreme Court, disqualify Danny Pomanto on totally baseless grounds. All the responsible electoral authorities rejected Arifudin's suit, but finally the Supreme Court, which is not supposed to take part in these types of decisions, disqualified Danny Pomanto. But then the electoral rules specify that when there's only one candidate left in the race, then voters have a choice to tick an empty box on the ballot.
I love this.
And so on election day, voters got up and went down to the polling station, and 53% chose an empty box rather than Arifudin. Yeah. So then there was an interim mayor since then, and now Danny Pomanto is running again against Arifudin next month, and they've had a couple of candidate debates. There's 4 tickets in the race, so it's kind of a complicated thing, but that's going to be very interesting to watch, I think.
Any polling out of there? Does it look like he's going to win? Please tell me that he's going to win.
Yeah, there has been polling that showed Danny Pomanto way ahead. And now just this week, Arifudin's people are claiming that he has almost caught up, but they're citing a polling firm that nobody's ever heard of before. So
Ah, that old chestnut, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's
I've got
actually
a polling firm.
yeah.
Was that Trafalgar? The Trafalgar?
Trafalgar was-
I didn't know Trafalgar did polling here.
yeah, well, they ended up actually being pretty accurate after all.
That's true. That's true. Well, you are confirming for me that I need to get out of Jakarta more. COVID has kept me cooped up for too long. I'm stewing in my own juices here. Here's this sort of segue for my final question. Speaking of someone who's managed to get out of Jakarta, Luhut.
Yeah.
Luhut goes to Washington to
Yeah.
meet of all people Donald Trump. Why? The guy's on the way
Right.
out.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, he really spent a lot of time and energy having meetings with people who are at the final 1% of their time in office and whose
Yeah.
policies are going to change radically next year. But he did also meet with the head of the World Bank, the head of the IMF, the head of Conservation International. So there were some more substantive people that he met with too. But it was interesting to see how his Oval Office meeting came about, because basically the Trump administration has created the Development Investment Corporation, and the head of that is Scott Bowler, and that's a college roommate of Jared Kushner. Bowler, in his new role, is looking at Indonesia, because anybody in a role like his automatically looks at Indonesia, because it's a haven for that type of work that this entity is intending to do in terms of financing development projects. So he has visited Indonesia twice this year and met with both Widodo and Luhut. So therefore, when Luhut went to Washington, he met Bowler. And because Bowler was the college roommate of Kushner, and because Kushner is married to Ivanka Trump, and Ivanka brought them all in, I think, to see Donald Trump. It seems like that's how that played out, and that's why Luhut was one of the only people in the world to have a public Oval Office meeting during this 10-day period in which President Trump very rarely emerged in public at all. It was a little bit surreal.
What kind of presence might Trump have in Indonesia once he leaves office? Any plans for Trump resorts and the like here?
Yeah, Harry Tanusudibio is his partner in the Lido Lakes development, which has a Trump-branded resort. So, it's the usual branding deals that Trump has for properties around the world. There's at least 2 in Indonesia, at Lido, and another in Bali. So, yeah, that matters. It's part of the family portfolio, but not a crucial part, I wouldn't think. The anecdotal accounts were that when these deals first happened about close to 10 years ago now, Trump was really not aware of what Indonesia was at the time. So it's not really a major point of attention for them, I don't think.
Not really on the radar at all. I was surprised he managed to get Trump off the golf course to come see Luhut. So wrapping up a year, coming to the end of a rather dreadful year. 2020 was probably an annus horribilis for everyone. The country, the GDP is shrinking for the first time since the financial crisis. Is there any powder left in Jokowi's keg to embark on another round of blockbuster reforms, or is that it for the rest of his term?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think Indonesia is at a juncture for some positive change, actually. A smooth vaccination program would finally bring the pandemic to heel. I think it's positive that the vaccine product introduced by Sinopharm is both effective, and also the company has disclosed its phase 1/2 trial results very transparently, which helps confidence in that respect. And the omnibus law is in place. It's going to face a constitutional court challenge, but I anticipate it withstanding that challenge. And that should improve the investment climate at the margins, at least. And there's real potential to bring in investment in the future, especially from China, and to finally boost manufacturing. There's a need for institutional reform. That's really what's been holding back investment. because of legal uncertainties that elevate the risk profile, that increases costs for all businesses in the economy, foreign and domestic, large and small. What's promising, I think, is that it's literally promising because Widodo 2 weeks ago promised to embark after the omnibus implementation on reform of the bureaucracy, which sounds dull, but it's actually the key thing that Indonesia needs to bring about a state apparatus that functions with more meritocracy and more professionalism and brings about that legal certainty that economic actors need.
And regulatory certainty too. Fewer flip-flop, more clarity about who's making the rules and when they're going to change and why.
Yeah, absolutely. Just rules done with more coherence at a national level and more professionalism in terms of the on-the-ground implementation, and with less interference from special interests and fewer rent-seeking schemes.
Well, from your lips to God's ears. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me again. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. Likewise, thank you.
And that's the program. Thanks to Kevin O'Rourke for joining. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Research by Imam Shoforn. Music by Epidemic Sound. If you like us, please subscribe and rate us. It helps. You can reach us on Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.